In response to what the CIA had accomplished with their Antarctic stations in Arcticus, the Soviets built a larger station in Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic. 30,000 prisoners in an exceptionally pure gas concentration created a flesh interface, which went through all 7 stages in less than 13 minutes and became a full-fledged portal. Within a day, the typical fluctuating metallic cylinders were visible, and within 3 days, they were extending miles into the sky. The Soviets quickly realized that the portal was growing out of control. In previous instances, they had simply bombed the site from the air. But in this case, the enormous cylinders and attendant incident zone, extending to the edge of space, prevented this as well as missile strikes. There was also an exceptionally large lateral incident zone around the portal, with segmentation occurring miles out from the site. Alarmed by the zone's uncontrolled growth and the growing underground tunnels, aka ant farms, the Soviets worked feverishly to construct a hydrogen bomb of unprecedented power, which could be detonated from outside the incident zone and still collapse the portal. The steady rate of growth in the incident zone provided them with an exact deadline, which they managed to meet with only 2 hours to spare. Any later, and the bomb could not have been placed, so as to collapse the interface. In short, the world came within 2 hours being subjected to an uncontrolled flesh interface, and perhaps the end of civilization, as we know it. Before the portal was collapsed, however, the Soviets had gained first-hand knowledge of one of the so-called sister cities. In other words, somebody had gone into the portal and come back. I've always found Lisa's dream to be a good starting place when trying to understand the psychological effects of travel. Lisa was a 9-year-old girl sent through the Groom Lake Interface in 1975. The Groom Lake Interface connects to the so-called sister city, technically persistent locus, known as the Hanging Temples. She stayed there for 5 days of normal time, but only 48 seconds of beyond time. A marked discrepancy. Upon returning, she did not recall anything beyond becoming drowsy for a moment. She slept well that night, and in the morning she recounted a dream to the doctors, before dying later in the day. A direct transcript of the audio from her interview.
It was spring and it had been raining all day, but the rain stopped just before it was going to be sunset. So all the clouds were purply and the sky was really orange, and the grass was all wet with rain, and there were fireflies around, like all in the sky, way up in the sky, big ones. And me and my grandma went out to these hills way out past the edge of town, and under the hills there were people sleeping, not in caves. They were buried under the hills. The people were asleep, but they were hugging each other. Families, like moms and dads and little kids, just packed together. A few thousand. The hills were just blown up like balloons because they were so full of people. Like a pregnant woman's stomach. My grandma told me to lie down, but I didn't want to. She laid down and got sucked into the ground. I heard her voice coming out of the ground, telling me to come inside.
It would be easy to say that the Soviets discovered the secret of survivable travel because they were more ruthless, more willing to sacrifice innocent lives. But there was really no lack of ruthlessness on the part of the CIA. It was really just a matter of approach. The Soviets approached the mystery of the flesh interfaces the same way they approached their space program. The first humans in space, the so-called lost cosmonauts, who were never officially acknowledged, were just ordinary people, culled from the gulags, with no more control over their missions than Laika the dog. The Americans, on the other hand, started with professional men, usually from the military. Likewise, when it was discovered that the objects and even animals which entered the flesh interfaces occasionally returned unharmed, the Americans began training men to enter the interfaces. Because they called their men from certain military ranks, they were all of similar ages. The Soviets, however, used prisoners, who had much wider age range, and so they were able to discover the essential correlation. The younger a person was, the more likely they were to survive travel, and the longer they would survive after travel. They discovered that 20-somethings were much more likely to survive, albeit in a horribly altered state, than older people. They discovered that people in their early 20s fared better than those in their late 20s. Teenagers fared even better. So despite all moral compunction, it was really a matter of time before they sent a child through. And it was only after the first round of children went through that they gained any idea of what was on the other side. This kind of psychological mirroring was exploited in the design of the flesh interfaces. When a human body is embedded in an interface, the independent, i.e., non-human, interface glands produce massive amounts of LSD, which cause intellectual mutations, i.e., time fracturing along several dozen axes. Meanwhile, independent hormone regulators produce a emotional oscillation between two states. 1. Euphoria. 2. Terror. Thus we have the typical sound of an interface, alternating waves of giggling and screaming that move through the interface population, running along the length of the interface as the hormones travel along the independent conduits. These successive waves of giggling and screaming create a steady rhythm that washes over the traveler as they move through the interface. Natural empathetic responses, mirroring, prepare the traveler's body for the process of embrace. Many people believe that Michael Jackson died due to propofol. Not so. He was murdered. He had actually been taking propofol nightly since around 1980, not in order to make himself sleep, but to suppress REM sleep. After several months of REM sleep suppression, the user becomes receptive. In other words, they enter the same state achieved by prolonged continuous immersion in aerosol LSD. The brain can physically restructure itself simply through thought. By reordering thought, one can physically reorder the brain. LSD, or long-term propofol use, makes the brain's neurostructure malleable. High-energy rays from outer space are able to penetrate the body, and these can lead to random mutations and cancers. And sometimes, they lead to changes that are not random at all. Changes which have been intentionally programmed. Changes designed to bring about civilization-level transformations. Michael Jackson was unaware of all of this. He merely knew that propofol allowed him to enter sort of waking dream state of heightened creativity. The side effects were horrifying paranoia and obsession, but he felt that he was strong enough to endure these side effects. The success of Thriller seemed to vindicate his theories about propofol, and unfortunately, he was damned by his own success. So how did he die? Through the lyrics of Another Part of Me and the vegetable part of Wanna Be Startin' Something? it was quite clear that he had become receptive and neuro-altered in line with Master Design 9. But he was considered to be minimal threat, and even perhaps an asset until his mounting financial problems made him a liability. He was terminated. Thought I'm not sure of the exact means. Society is built on interfaces. You take a complex thing, put it inside a sturdy box, and put some simple buttons on the box so that people can use the thing inside. The box makes it easier to use and prevents people from breaking it. For example, you can take the machinery of a clock, put it in a box, and put 2 hands on the outside along with a knob for winding it. Take all the machinery of a car, hide it behind a dashboard, and give people 2 pedals and wheel. Take all the circuits of a computer, put them in a box, and give people a monitor and a keyboard. Interfaces receive input and produce output, and that's all we need to know. The clock gets wound and its hands show the time, input, and output. As far as the user needs to know, what happens inside the box is magic. This allows stupid and ignorant people to use complicated things, as long as the interface inputs and outputs are simple. Toyota uses millions of kilograms of steel every year. Does the CEO of Toyota know how to make steel from scratch? If he wanted to beat a guy up, could he go digging in the ground for some ore and whip himself up a batch of steel to make a pipe? No. He uses interfaces to get steel. He buys steel from a steelmaking company. Except he doesn't personally go down to the steelmaking company with a bag full of yen saying, "How much for 1,000,000 kilos?" He uses a bank. Except he doesn't even personally go to the bank. He has a subordinate who does it for him. All these people and institutions are interfaces he can use. He employs a system of layered interfaces, both metaphorical and literal, to control things he doesn't really understand. We all do. The point is this: don't go messing with the CEO of Toyota. I assure you, he could get his hands on a steel pipe, if he wanted. The word interface refers to the input and the output, but it also refers to the box. We think of interfaces as existing in order to give us access to things, but they are also there to hide things from us. The idea is that some things are better off hidden. Everything will go along fine, so long as a certain input produces the expected output. But when this stops happening, we have to open up the box and see what's inside. Sometimes, we don't like what we find.